So, this article from The Economist today pretty much sums up Brexit, currently. So, just over a year has passed since Britain voted to leave the European Union and Theresa May subsequently became Prime Minister. Nearly 4 months have elapsed since Mrs May invoked Article 50 of the EU Treaty, setting a 2-year deadline for Brexit that will expire on March 30th, 2019. The clock is ticking. And at first, the blush that has been much activity, a big speech by Mrs May at Lancaster House in January, several government white papers, bills introduced in Parliament, and the start of formal Brexit negotiations in Brussels. Yet, for all this activity, almost no progress has been made towards deciding the form that Brexit should take. That is largely because the government is ambiguous over what it wants. What have I been saying for these past couple of videos? That is largely because even the issues that seem settled in the Lancaster House speech have resurfaced since Mrs May lost her parliamentary majority in the snap election she called for on the 8th of June. This is the political backdrop to which the Brexit talks in Brussels are taking place. The second round of talks started this week, beginning negotiation teams led for the EU by Michael Breitner and the European Commissioner's point man for Britain by David Davis, the Brexit Secretary. Mr Breitner, who has a mandate approved by European governments, is focusing on the terms of Article 50 for divorce, specifically the rights of the EU citizens in Britain and vice versa, how to avoid a border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and Britain's exit bill. Only when he can report sufficient progress on these will he be allowed to start discussing the long-term trade relationship between Britain and the EU. Making progress will not be easy. An initial British offer to give EU citizens broadly the same rights as Britain's was met with complaints that it was insufficiently generous. The Irish border question, which has been elevated to top-level diplomatic talks, has no obvious answer. And although Britain has considered that it faces an exit bill, the size is highly contentious. This week's round of talks concluded with little progress on any of the three main topics. It is the long-term relationship that matters most. As I've said before, trade is important. Our trade with EU may be 44%, but when you break it down by those individual businesses, you are seeing 60-70%. 64% of our farming products go to the EU. Where were we? Yes. It is the long-term relationship that matters most, because Mrs May and Mr Davis insist that the only interpretation of the referendum is that Britain's voted to take back control of borders, laws and money, and are pushing for what is known as a hard Brexit. Britain must leave both the EU single market and its customs union, end free movement of people from the EU, and escape from the oversight of the EU Supreme Court, the European Court of Justice, the ECJ. Instead, it will forge a deep and special partnership with the EU, including a comprehensive free trade deal. Yet Mrs May's election setback has raised questions of whether her hard Brexit should be softened. Although Labour's leader Jeremy Corbyn backs ending free movement, his manifesto also talked of keeping all benefits of the single market. A week ago, he refused to rule out staying in the single market after all. Meanwhile, some of the ministers think that the customs union should be rethought. The latest row is over ETROM, Europe's atomic energy treaty, which Britain will leave on exiting the EU, but which some Tory MPs think that it should rejoin as an associate. Mrs May's lack of a majority in either house means that the role of Parliament which has been sidelined, will be crucial. The government has just published its EU withdrawal bill and is promising at least 7 other Brexit bills ranging from immigration to agriculture to trade and customs. Getting all these through unamended will be extremely difficult. Opposition MPs talk of fighting the government all the way, and with the help of perhaps a dozen Tory rebels, rather as happened to John Major when he was trying to ratify the Maastricht Treaty in the 1990s, there is no clear parliamentary majority for a hard Brexit, so delivering one will be very challenging to say the least. So this comes on to what I call the cake problem. So why is there so much confusion? One answer is simply that extracting Britain from a 44-year marriage is horrendously complex. But a deeper problem is that voters were never told the truth about the trade-offs inherent in Mrs May's version of Brexit. What have I been saying to you in these past Brexit videos? Brexiteers promised that, in the words of Boris Johnson, now the Foreign Secretary, Britain could have its cake and eat it. It would be possible, they claimed, to escape the EU regulation and the ECJ, leave the single market and walk away from the customs union and save $350 million a week in budget contributions, while still retaining the benefits of being an integral part of the world's biggest trade bloc. This misleading claim explains why the other 27 EU countries were apprehensive about the government's approach to Brexit. Although they preferred Mrs May, who campaigned on the Remain side, to the other Tories, they also knew that her main experience of the EU came in 2013 when, as the Home Secretary, she negotiated Britain's opt-out from a raft of justice and home affairs measures, and then chose which ones to opt back into. That cherry-picking approach was quite specific to that particular dossier. It cannot be done by a country turning its back on a club altogether. The EU 27 are determined to stop any attempt at repeating it with Brexit. Talk by various ministers in London of a no deal being better than a bad deal also went down badly in Brussels. I wonder why. A Brexit without a deal would certainly be bad for the EU, but it would be far worse for Britain. Goods would back up with no customs agreement. Air travel would stop without an aviation deal. Tariffs and non-tariff barriers would appear overnight. The EU also frets over Mrs May's belief that her predecessor, David Cameron, failed to win enough concessions in his EU negotiations because of his unwillingness to walk away. In Brussels, the bargaining power is seen as being on the EU side, not at least because of Article 50's 2-year deadline. What have we been? Again, EU has all the power. We have no power and this idea that we can just cherry pick is ridiculous because we have no leverage in this. So this is reflected in the EU's approach to Brexit, which is to insist that the future relations must follow one of a number of fixed-priced menus. Each menu has its advantages and disadvantages. Each has a few side dishes that can be added at the margin. But what is not permitted is to go à la carte. Mr Banner underlined this recently when he declared that it was not possible to leave the single market but retain all its benefits, not to quit the customs union but to keep frictionless trade. The first menu is full membership, which the Brexit referendum rejected. Second is membership of the European Economic Area, which is what we really want to be in. This would be the least damaging option to us, which the likes of Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein to the EU. The EEA, the European Economic Area members, are fully integrated into the EU single market for most goods and services, but not for agricultural and fisheries. They are not in a customs union with the EU, which allows them to strike free trade deals with third countries. Although this means their exports are also subject to rules of origin inspection, but the single market rules require them to accept the EU's for freedom of movement for goods, services and capital, and crucially people. They also have to observe laws which they have no say in making, and which, at least implicitly, are enforced by European judges. And they also make contributions to the EU budget almost as large as Britain's on a per-person basis. So the third option is the Swiss one. Along with Norway and Iceland, Liechtenstein and Switzerland is a member of the European Free Trade Association, but it is not in the EEA. It has two sets of complex bilateral deals with the EU which give it privileged access to the single market for most services, including financial services. It is also outside the customs union. It too has to observe the free movement of people and to accept most single market laws, and it makes big contributions to the EU budget. Mrs May's insistence on taking back control of borders, laws and money means that she has ruled out both these menus. Yet some frills could be attached to make more appealing the EEA countries have an emergency brake to block free movement of people. Though this has never been used, Liechtenstein is allowed to set quotas for EU migrants, the Swiss are not, but they may be allowed to ensure that most jobs are offered to Swiss citizens. As for budget payments, they are smaller than for most full members and are mostly dressed up as research funds or aid to Eastern Europe. But Britain would struggle to get a deal like that of Switzerland. The EU dislikes the complexity of the arrangement, and it would be unlikely to replicate it for a far bigger British economy. The fourth menu might be called the Turkish. Like San Marino, Andorra, Turkey is not in the EEA, the EF or the single market, but it has formed a customs union with the EU for non-agricultural goods and trade. That forces Turkey to apply common external tariffs fixed by the EU, but that brings the advantage that there is no barriers or rules of origin checks on exports to the EU. If Britain were to form a customs union with the EU, it could try and add some services as well. Currently, Turkey and the EU are negotiating an upgrade of their own customs union to do just that. The advantage of being in a customs union but not in the single market is that it dispenses with the EU's four freedoms, budget contributions and the ECJ. It would also prevent the return of customs controls at the Irish border. The main disadvantage of the customs union option is that it precludes free trade deals for goods with third countries. In effect, it would do Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, out of a job. Yet some argue that barrier-free trade in goods with the EU is worth more than any number of hypothetical future free trade deals with third countries being touted by Dr. Fox. To quote the words from one MP, "We export more to Ireland than we do to China, and almost twice as much to Belgium as we do to India, and nearly 3 times as much to Sweden as we do to Brazil. It is not realistic to think that we could just replace European trade with these new markets." This was Mrs May speaking in April 2016. So as you can see, she knows this. They know that the damage that this is going to do, but they're just refusing to do anything about it because they are terrified of, upsetting the Brexiteers and this nonsense. But, they need to do something. They need to decide. The second option, to end up like Norway, is going to be the best option for us. Why? Because it limits the most damage. And the fifth menu that the Prime Minister herself favours is a deep and comprehensive free trade deal. Examples include the association agreement with the Ukraine and two simpler trade deals with Canada and Japan. The latter not yet concluded. This would preserve tariff-free trade access for most goods and services and cover some services, though not usually financial services. It would mean no free movement, no automatic adoption of EU regulations, and probably no ECJ. Though the dispute resolution mechanism would remain needed and would be in place. The disadvantage is that free trade is not the same as frictionless trade. There would be custom controls and rules of origin checks. Many services would not be covered, and there would be non-tariff barriers thanks to different regulation. The final menu, which would also be likely, is the end to follow from no deal. It is to revert to trading with the EU under the World Trade Organization rules. This is not totally straightforward, because although Britain is a WTO member, its tariff and import schedule is set via the EU, and having a schedule of its own would require dividing up the EU's important quotas for things like New Zealand butter. Trading on WTO terms implies small tariffs on goods such as cars and pharmaceuticals, and larger ones on farm products. It does not cover services. Non-tariff barriers would remain, and there is the WTO's most favoured nation principle, which we've talked about before, which allows discriminatory trade practices only in an approved free trade area. That means that if Britain and the EU agreed to a mutual 10% tariff on cars, they would have to offer the same deal to every single other country. So, as you can see, no deal is quite frankly just not an option. We need to go the Norway route. It is the only route that will will result in the least amount of damage to us, and it's the sensible road to go, because, you know, the idea that these Brexiteers seem to have in their head is that somehow we are, you know, going to pull up a magic anchor and just sail away from the EU and sail away from Europe into God knows what, and that magically the British Empire is going to reform and we're going to have all this trade and it's going to be wonderful. And there's no fact. It's a fairy tale. This is the fairy tale that they've been telling ever since the referendum. In fact, even before the referendum. So we continue. So the Brexit menus share two characteristics. One is that except for the EEA option, they would take time, perhaps several years to negotiate. The second is that they all impose losses on the economy. Brexiteers rejected the Treasury's projections for the cost of Brexit last year as Project Fear. But the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics has remodelled the trade consequences. It concludes that the hardest form of Brexit, a reversion to the WTO terms, would cut trade by 40% and reduce annual income per person by 2.6%. A softer version, like the Norwegian model, would cut trade by 20 to 25 and reduce annual incomes by 1.3. And these are just static effects. There would also be dynamic negative effects from lower investment, slower productivity growth. Britons are unprepared for such a hit to their incomes, and the more distant Britain's relationship with the EU, the bigger the income loss. This is a crucial trade-off that Mrs May's government has been reluctant to acknowledge. Not only her, but Labour and all the other parties as well. Probably not the Liberal Democrats, because they're the only ones that are speaking about this. Britons face a choice. To minimise losses from Brexit, they must cede some sovereignty to the EU. While to minimise freedom from Brussels, they must accept a larger drop in incomes. What makes this choice harder is the state of the economy. Immediately after the referendum, Brexiteers crowed that the doomsayers were wrong. The economy had not suffered and confidence remained high. Yet, in the first quarter of 2017, Britain fell from being one of the fastest growing economies in the EU to the slowest growing. Because of uncertainties over Brexit, higher inflation, caused partly by the fall of the pound, is eating into real incomes. It is no wonder that Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, is demanding that the economy should be given the highest priority in the Brexit negotiations. Labour is also arguing for a jobs-first Brexit. Nor is trade with the EU the only problem in Brexit. Before even getting into new trade deals, Dr. Fox must find a way to replicate the 35 free trade agreements that Britain currently has via the EU with 53 countries. The raw arithmetic is that some 44% of British exports go to the EU, 16% to countries with the EU that the EU has a free trade deal with, and about 20% to America. Donald Trump may have promised an early deal with Britain, but experience shows that it will neither be easy nor quick, and Mr. Trump may be long gone. Third countries need to know the terms of Britain's trade with the EU. Before making bilateral deals, Monique Elber of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, a think tank, calculates that downgrading from a single market to a free trade deal with the EU would reduce British trade by about a fifth, whereas free trade deals with the 4 BRIC countries, plus America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, South Africa, combined would boost it by just 5%. The next question of EU regulations, of which Eurotam is but one. Some 35 EU regulatory bodies govern such things as medicine, aviation safety, environmental rules, financial services. The list goes on, and we've already said, when we get rid of these bodies, these European bodies, we are going to have to create them in Britain. And that's going to cost us more. That is going to expand the government. So you're going to have a Minister for Aviation. You're going to have a government, the Health Secretary is going to have to undertake pharmaceutical industry, which is a massive part. It's not a small thing. And all come under the European Court of Justice. So if that remains, a red line for Mrs May's Britain must set up a new set of regulators of its own. These would largely have to replicate the EU's rules to maintain regulatory equivalence. Most companies prefer to stick with the system they know, and many fear that setting up British regulators will not only take time and money, but also force them to obey two rules, not one. There is also much else to do, something of which the powers reciprocated from Brussels should go to the devolved administrations will be testing. The Scots say they may hold up the EU withdrawal bill, and Labour supports them. Hundreds of treaties on matters ranging from air transportation to data sharing must be renegotiated with third countries. Ways must be found to cooperate with scientific research, foreign policy, defence, security, counter-terrorism, intelligence. All of these raise yet another issue for the ECJ, which has jurisdiction over data sharing, various justice and home affairs measures, including European arrest warrants. So one conclusion is that this cannot possibly be dealt with by March 2019. To give the European Parliament time to ratify Article 50 divorce, the terms must be agreed by October 2018. Businesses that have to plan ahead, such as airlines, need certainty long before that. Without a deal allowing them to fly after Brexit, airlines might have to stop selling advance tickets. Banks and others want to know what rules they face by next spring, and that points to something else, which may long be assumed in Brussels that is slowly being accepted in London, that there must be a transition period after March 30th, 2019. Yet it will not be a simple one to arrange, because negotiators will want to know the ultimate destination, at least in principle, before agreeing to terms of transition. Brussels lobbies, and quietly the Treasury are pushing to stay in both the single market and the customs union during transition to minimise disruption. The simplest idea would be to prolong the status quo for 3 or 4 years, but that would not satisfy those who are keen to get on with leaving. An alternative might be a temporary EAA membership, but Brexiteers might fear that the temporary agreement would become permanent. Transition will be key to making Brexit less disruptive, but on its own it will not resolve the dilemmas facing the government. For that, more honesty, less intimidation to tear any critics that seek to subvert democracy, and greater readiness to acknowledge Brexit's trade-offs are required. The only other thing certain is that those who say the only way to take the EU off Britain's political agenda was to have a referendum have been proven utterly wrong. So that's the Economist's take on Brexit, and I agree. It's going to be an absolute omnishambles, completely, to borrow Malcolm Tucker's phrase. It's going to be awful from start to finish, and we're only just beginning. The best option, as said there, we need to end up like Norway. And that is what we need to start doing. We need to remain in the single market. We need to remain in the customs union. As I've just pointed out there, we do a lot of trade with Europe and, the countries within Europe, far more than we do anywhere else. This idea that we can just go, we'll just trade with everywhere else, will not be, is fantasy. The empire is not going to be restored. Britain will not magically sail away to some other part of the world. It's a fantasy, and I'm hopefully people are now starting to see this. We've already seen, since last summer, it was already being reported that individual households are now £100 less, £100 less off than they were before the Brexit vote. So it's already starting. But will Brexiteers care or listen or, whatever? They don't care. They'll just keep on, fingers in the ears, we don't care. And that's the danger of it. Because they aren't experts, they don't know a single thing about it, and when, for example, they see things like this, they don't care. To them, it's Project Fear again. But there you go. What do you think? Do you agree with what The Economist has had to say, or do you agree that it's going to be a fantasy land and that Britain will just up sticks and sail off to somewhere in the Caribbean so that we can at least have a warmer climate? Let me know what you think.